And so folks watching and listening, please support Jamar, because he and others like him are the linkage that allows all those parts of the body to communicate with each other, to interact with each other, to link with one another. Without this communication piece, we're just all doing our things separately. And so please support this platform, other platforms, other people like Jamar who are doing this work, because that's what we need to move this movement forward, grow it, build it, and eventually win.
You're damn right, Matthew Ho. And he's doing amazing work out in North Carolina. So freaking dope. How they were able to stop the Democrats from trying to block them from getting on the ballot and going all the way up to I think it was the Supreme Court of North Carolina, and now they were recognized as a party and stuff like that, especially when after almost getting kicked off. But that's dope. I have Tanya Burley with me, everybody. You remember her from last season. She's an artist and she's also a badass activist. And we're going to get right into what we always do, calling out capitalism, especially with what's happening this past week with a lot of talks about the U.S. crisis with infrastructure. And then we're going to chime in a little bit about Amtrak. I don't know how much you know about Amtrak, but we can talk about that lastly. So thank you so much for coming on, Tanya. I think this is really, really good conversation to have with the audience, and also putting a tribute to everyone that's contributing to everyone that's already talking about this. This is a struggle that literally is not new, but it definitely is something that comes up time for time, 24/7. Because we literally live in a place where, in a system that says it's first world, but everything from transportation to housing, it's everything is just bad. There's nobody to fix it. Water crisis with Jackson, and it always ends up minority neighborhoods and low income neighborhoods with this issue. There's no money to fix it. To give the Ukraine or causes on. There's billions of dollars. There's nothing to fix the actual infrastructure of this country.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I was just up in Boston, where I know they've been dealing with, I think it was the Orange Line caught on fire, and
wow,
the whole Orange Line has been shut down for a long time, and I believe they're shutting down some of the other lines too, to just do some maintenance stuff on all of them. But there's definitely all kinds of infrastructure failings all over this country that aren't being addressed nearly sufficiently enough, because we're going to see these kinds of things happening. When Biden showed up to advertise for his infrastructure plan back when they were pushing that, and then the bridge collapsed as soon as he arrived in the city.
And which bridge was that? That was
I forget which one exactly. I think it was in Chicago or Baltimore, or somewhere in there. And but yeah, luckily nobody was killed in that. There was just some injuries, but we're going to be seeing lots of these kinds of things happening. And like you said, there's not nearly enough funding going into infrastructure as it is. I think Biden's bill was 1.2 trillion, but I was just looking it up today just to make sure I got the numbers right. But I believe infrastructure as it stands in the United States is already something close to 3 trillion backed up in
God,
behind. And the ASCE, the civil engineers, basically for the nation, they released this whole report that I always recommend people to look at, and just sort of the dire state of our infrastructure, because they had done that number of the 3 trillion, as well as they predicted that just to maintain, the infrastructure, we're going to need 13 trillion over the next 20 years, whereas our current infrastructure plan has just 1 trillion over the next 10 years.
Oh my God.
So
this
definitely,
is a lot of wear and tear. Is this what they're estimating? Just like how much wear and tear damage that is this for the whole country, that there's $13 trillion worth of wear and tear damage in this country, basically.
yes, basically. And
Oh my
they're
God.
predicting that, equivalent amounts of GDP loss and job loss and other things are going to be upwards in that same area of 13 trillion, possibly like over that same period of terms of economic loss and job loss is going to be huge as a result of the infrastructure kind of beginning to collapse. So sort of kind of an ongoing theme of economic and imperial decline in the United States is this this is such a prominent example of it. I think anybody in the United States can go out and just see the condition of the infrastructure and the roads and everything else, and traffic being backed up all the time. I just had to wait in like an hour of traffic today because they were trying to rebuild some of the roads, and like there's certainly so much more funding needs to be going to things like rail and other networks, and they just aren't. They're going, mostly to, as you mentioned, Ukraine and other parts of the war effort. I think a lot of
they just dropped billions of dollars for Taiwan recently.
Yep.
And they want to have them buy a lot of their weapons, which I don't understand where they're getting weapons from, because they're running out of weapons with supplying to Ukraine. They're like behind, so I don't even know where this is coming from. But they prioritize, our viewers, so for you to understand, they prioritize that when there's 13 of damage that should be in the United States. It's a big number. I didn't even know it was that bad.
Yeah, it's not looking great working in the field of engineering myself. It's pretty distressing having to, work and design on projects that are, so much of it is just like reconstructing what's already there just to kind of keep it, maintain the best you can. But even then, it's never enough. And it's a lot of like the design that this whole country was built around, cars and stuff. And I always like to mention that the reason for this sort of why our infrastructure is so much more expensive compared to other countries is largely due to suburbanization. Basically, countless studies have come out talking about how suburbanization is basically not profitable by any means in the long term. It is basically a large Ponzi scheme of you have to build more suburbs in order to pay for repairs on previous suburbs. And when cities start running out of land like they already are, you see a lot of these cities going bankrupt in the United States. Several cities have already filed for bankruptcy, but a lot of that is because just maintaining roads with such low density in the suburbs is unsustainable. And the reason why America cares so much largely has to do with white flight from cities in the 1950s and such. When all the white folk moved out of the cities, they insisted that they still get the same level of infrastructure that they were getting in the cities. And so a lot of our infrastructure basically catered to the will of the white suburbanites who moved out of the cities. And as a result of that, people that are living in the cities, largely people of color, have been basically paying the buck in their taxes. And there's a lot of interesting data showing like how much more people that live in urban areas pay just to keep suburbs well maintained.
All right, you just said a lot of eye openers right there that even I didn't even realize. Like, I understand redlining and separation and all this stuff like that, but I didn't realize that the whole concept of a suburb. I mean, I should have. I mean, clearly, yeah, because white flight happened. All the white people started leaving, and they want to go to suburbs. But I didn't realize that the cost to keep up the suburbs is also a big issue as well too, and it's making the cities be bankrupt. That's basically what? Wow. So basically, suburbs are an issue.
Yeah.
If we want to continue this society, we have suburbs have to be reevaluated.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a statistic I read about that. They said that in Texas alone, the world population, if they all was to stand together, arm to arm, the whole entire world population could fit in Texas. So that tells me that if we build cities that make it more feasible and more access with public transportation and stuff like that, it economically is better than building suburbs. But everybody wants to. It's like the standard in America. You want to have a White House and a picket fence, basically.
Yeah, it's definitely been sold as the American dream, which is very whitewashed in terms of because that is just taking up way more land and way more space than is in the end of the day economically, environmentally sustainable.
Wow.
Like I said, because to explain it basically and conceptually, when you think about just in terms of utilization of utilities, such as when you build a suburb, you have these long roads with maybe only a few houses on them, but all of these
Right.
houses have to have electricity and water and septic and all of these things, and so you have
Right.
these massive utilities that are only serving a tiny portion of people. Whereas in the cities, it's much more cost effective to have a water line go through that serves, a building that has, 20 people living in it or something like that. And,
Right.
but again, they make the cities make the folks living in the inner city and towards the downtowns pay for the outward expansion of the suburbs, which are by far more expensive than anything that's going on in the city.
Mm.
So.
Mm. And people in the suburbs, I don't know how. I never grew up in the suburbs. I always been a city guy, but I did grow up. I did grow up partly in North Carolina, which is not considered suburbs. It's the country. It's a rural area, right? That's like what you'll call it a rural area. It took me a while to understand the difference between a suburb and a rural area for a while, but now I finally get it. And I see exactly what you mean because basically the costs. So are they spending the same amount? No, they're not, right? Because majority of people they still own their houses in the suburbs, right?
Yeah.
So they also have to pay out of pocket to contribute towards fixing the water pipeline or sewage, whatever that happens to their home. But when the city has to when the town has to fix it, the cost is similar to the cost of the city, or is it also is it more because it's a lot more land? Because I know that it's less people being serviced than the city when that happens. It's a lot less more people, but is that what it is? It's like the same price.
It's the same price. It's just
Wow.
that in terms of our taxes pay for these things for the towns
Right.
to come in and build these roads and build these utilities, and so it's just a matter of getting a return on the public and investment that are neighborhoods, and it's a lot more cost effective to build a water line for a house of 20 people, and then you can get taxes from 20 people to pay for that, whereas in a suburb you have even more utilities over a long stretch of road to service 3 people, and those 3 people, either their taxes have to be incredibly high to pay for the entire road that they live on and all of those utilities, or that funding has to come from somewhere else. In rural
And it comes
towns,
from the city.
yeah,
That
and
funding.
yeah, when there's suburbs that are near the cities, the all that funding comes from inside the city, where the higher density population is that is taxed, and that goes
Yeah.
outwards to paying for the denser areas where less people are living.
So before you get to rurals, so basically you're saying that me and my partner living in this small and the taxes that we pay also helps out with the suburbs like Beaver Hills, Westville of New Haven, and the Cove, where all those nice houses and mansions, those suburban areas. We're basically the city, inner city people, black and brown people, which is majority in the city, are paying for their maintenance as well too, because we are a dense population compared to how small the population is in the suburbs.
Yeah, that's pretty much exactly
what
it is.
fuck? Talk about robbing the poor, yo. Oh my god.
It's a very capitalist, very racist approach that, kind of is unfortunate but not surprising coming from America.
Mm-hmm. I never knew that. There's always so much things about infrastructure that you don't think about. Like, that's crazy.
It's a large part, and railroads play a large part of that if you want to get into talking about the railroad strike and sort of the train infrastructure in general. Because, trains play a huge part, despite the fact that they are also underfunded and haven't seen any major updates in decades. But just looking at the railroad strike that was set to begin today, freight, 30% of all freight and just goods transported in the United States is by rail.
Wow.
And
that's a big significant number.
Yeah, that is a huge number or proportion of goods that are transported via freight. And but you see with the workers that are planning on going on strike, their conditions have been getting worse and worse because all of our trains and trains lines are privatized. You can argue, except for Amtrak, which is sort of a public-private partnership where the government has the majority or is the majority stakeholder, but the government doesn't own the rail lines that Amtrak trains run on. So even though Amtrak itself has these trains that run and are somewhat publicly funded, the vast majority of our train networks are privately owned, and what you have then is just a large, completely disorganized rail network. I like to point out that in the UK they had nationalized train network for a long time, and due to a lot of lobbying from the rich folk there, they managed to convince the government to privatize or defund and then eventually privatize the entire rail network. And that ended up being so disastrous. It resulted in multiple train crashes because multiple companies were having to communicate together, and fares prices rose incredibly. There was a huge movement to basically renationalize the train network, which the UK government largely gave into eventually. But that's just an example of how bad a privately run train network is. And you can't even the reason why it's so difficult is because all of our train networks are all interconnected in such a huge way. I used to run or work on the railroad myself for a couple jobs, and we'd be working on one section of rail, and then there's a slight turn in the tracks, and that's no longer Amtrak, that's now this company, so we can't cross that line. If something has to be done on those tracks, a new team has to be hired that's certified by that company to go on, and it's just this huge complicated mess. And but that's why you see this possible union strike to be such a big deal, because even though it's only on certain lines of the United States, it basically would cause all of the train networks in our country to grind to a halt, because all of our rail networks are so interconnected, even though they're owned by private entities. And but you can see definitely the massive power that our rail network and the workers that work on them have throughout this whole process. This has been an ongoing process. The Biden already had to step in 2 months ago in order
What did
to.
he do actually? Like, because I heard that they spoke to him yesterday, and whatever he said to them is the reason why they decided not to strike. So what the hell did Biden say to Amtrak?
Well, to sort of like wind back the clock a little bit and talk about just
Mhm.
like how the government generally interacts with these kinds of like the railroad and rail strikes. And the last major rail strike was exactly 30 years ago in
Mhm.
1992. And it was actually a much smaller amount of workers that were threatening to strike. But even though it was a smaller network or number of workers, it still would have resulted in the entire shutdown of all U.S. freight, and that
Wow.
became a massive emergency for the federal government. And so once again, that time was the Bush administration had to step in, and they ended up
Bush
giving in.
Senior, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
or no, Bush Jr. Bush Jr. 1992. Oh yeah, no, Bush Senior. Anyway, presidents.
Right.
And but yeah, so basically, there was a or what companies have already done here, but they did back in 1992 is called a lockout, where they start cutting off rail lines basically in anticipation of a strike. And this is
Mhm.
basically to put pressure on the federal government to come in, and the rail companies' demands are to force their workers to go back to work without accepting a deal, and that is why
Right.
they do these lockouts. Um, so this did bring the government to the table, and the Bush administration at that time, did take the side of the rail companies, and or for the most part, and immediately instituted a uh, believe it was the Railway Labor Act, but they basically used it to force the workers to go back to work. They basically made it illegal to strike if you're a rail worker.
Wow.
And their secession to the union was that they also, or it was more to keep the economy going, was they also made it illegal to do the lockout. Um, and that kind of set the precedent of the federal government to play a role in these negotiations, since freight and rail networks are such a large part of how our country is built. That
Wow.
uh so basically that's sort of the backdrop and setting the stage for what happened these past few months, which is the union threatened to strike. I think it was back in July.
Mhm.
But Biden used that same sort of precedent and the Railway Labor Act to stop the strike, tell everybody to go back to work. And in the act, it's basically a 2-month cooling off period. So
Mhm.
the strike doesn't happen, workers are forced to go back to work, and the lockout doesn't happen until 2 months are up. And then theoretically, the unions are free to strike. Um, so that's what
So he
happened in the
basically just
deadline.
prolonged their protest. He just prolonged their strike.
Yeah, and that was a big criticism of when they did the same thing in 1992. There was lots of people complaining that you're just prolonging this, but that's what Biden did.
Right.
And so today was the day that it was set to end, so that the union can go on strike. And you already saw that the train networks ahead of uh, today, earlier this week, already started locking down again, canceling long-term train routes,
As they
and
should.
threatening to do more because they wanted to once again have the federal government step in and intervene, and ideally lobby them to give them the better deal, and to kind of force the workers to accept a worse deal than the one that they want. But unlike in 1992, this was, a large amount of workers. I think it's 115,000 rail workers were
Wow.
theoretically going to be a part of the strike. It was multiple unions across the nation. It would have definitely been enough to, stop effectively 100% of all freight. And given how weak the supply chain is already, given everything with COVID and whatnot, is definitely it would have been a nail in the coffin of our economy, which people already say is headed towards a recession, but that would definitely cause that. But
oh hell yeah,
yeah, but so I don't know exactly what Biden said, but I imagine that due to the sheer amount of labor workers that are involved and threatening to strike, as well as sort of the rising tide of unions that have been propping up all over the United States, there's just a lot of pressure to, as opposed to 1992, to lean closer to the union side. And so, whatever Biden said clearly took more of the side of the worker, because the tentative deal that they signed was that the union workers would see a 24% increase in pay over 5 years, as well as a $5,000 bonus every year. And the main sticking point of why the strike was happening is workers weren't allowed sick leave. So if you got COVID, if you had a heart attack,
what?
you would be reprimanded and punished and deducted pay for taking a day off, because rail workers are largely forced to be on call 24/7. So if their
I
employer
did not
calls, they
know
have to go
that.
to work, even if they're sick. And if they physically can't go because they're sick, then they are still punished for not going in. So that was the large impetus for this strike, was sort of the stripping away of sick leave, especially given the pandemic, and everything really put the pressure on the workers and the rail companies, leading up to this strike, as well as all these freight companies have been seeing record smashing profits in the past couple of years. We're talking tens of billions of dollars in profits, and because all of these rail networks are privately owned, all of those profits are going to the CEOs of whatever company owns them, and none of that is getting back to the workers. In fact, the real wages of rail workers have been decreasing for decades, and despite these record profits, and eventually, due to COVID and the sick leave, is finally enough to get the workers to want to strike, which is obviously a huge deal for our nation, such that Biden had to step in himself and go on like a 20-hour meeting. But this
Yeah,
definitely is
20-hour
just,
meeting. Wow,
yeah,
wow.
that's a lot for Biden.
Yeah, he's old as hell. I
Yeah,
hope that he was present that whole 20 hours. I really do.
yeah. So, but yeah, so I mean, this is just a huge, great example of just how powerful labor unions and workers are, and how essential we are to this country. That just because this one group of unions that were running the rails threatened to strike, it created effectively a national emergency, and President Biden himself had to step in and basically meet most of the workers' demands, uh,
Yeah,
just to
and he's
avert this
always
huge
used to just
crisis.
ignoring shit. He's always used
Yeah,
to just ignoring shit. So
yeah, he just ignores everything. I think, it's only just now I saw something in the news where he put money towards fixing the water crisis in Jackson, Mississippi, but that's been
wow.
going on for, a very long, like I believe like month or two now, where,
Yeah,
people in Jackson, Mississippi have no clean water, and doesn't react to that. But when railway workers go on strike,
right.
um, all of a sudden he cancels all of his plans and goes on a 20-hour meeting. Um,
Yeah.
and
And people are saying that like that whole thing 2 months. 2 months. That's a lot because sewage that's getting into their water when the water that they're supposed to drink. It's a lot of stuff that's getting into the water. It's not like you could just get a filter and just pour it through. That's not going to clean that. That's just going to make it like I mean, it might be a lighter color, but it's not going to be drinkable. Like for 2 months they had to deal with that, and he's finally sending money. Like that just tells you how much of a non-working class president of Biden that we have. Like he claims he's a labor He's a Labor president. He's a Labor Democrat. He's a union Democrat. He posted a nice little tweet about unions and all this shit on Twitter on Labor Day, and I called him out for that shit. I fucking made a video about how he doesn't even acknowledge Starbucks. That's where there's 200 stores unionizing, and he doesn't even acknowledge that because he's getting money from Starbucks. Starbucks is a huge donor to the Democratic Party, so of course he's not going to say nothing about fucking Starbucks illegally union busting. Like he's literally waiting till the fire gets big, like this whole Amtrak thing, and be like, God damn it, I have to do something. And he could have definitely tried to do something earlier on before it gets this goddamn traumatic.
Yeah, like exactly. And I believe what I saw in the article I read today was Biden's putting $5 million towards fixing the infrastructure there. But as you just said, in the blink of an eye, unanimously, $1 billion of weapons were sent to Taiwan. We've sent tens of billions of dollars to Ukraine. All of this money is going outwards towards war, and meanwhile, inside our country, everything is crumbling, whether it's the working conditions of our workers working on the railroad network itself falling apart. The American Society of Civil Engineers rated our trail network like a D-, I believe.
Jesus.
It is not in great shape, and even the incident in Jackson, Mississippi is a further example of what I was sort of explaining before, where the funding for infrastructure is pulled out of cities and put towards maintaining suburbs, because you don't see these big issues in the suburbs aren't nearly as frequent. But you have cities like Jackson, Mississippi, especially ones that are majority Black and brown people, are severely neglected, and all of their funding at the city and state level goes to making sure that white people in suburbs are comfortable and they have all of their needs. And we see that this is the end result of that, is water lines along the roads crumbling within the city and causing a massive disaster. So this is sort of an ongoing policy failure by both Democrats and the Republicans over decades of perpetuating this racist system, as well as just right now failing to react to it in a timely fashion at all. 2 months later, finally Biden does something.
Right. Oh my God. All right. We're getting down to the wire. And I just want to bring up a good example of people that actually focus on infrastructure and stuff like that, and made transportation and all this stuff, like public transportation, actually better. Like China being a 5,000-year-old country that's able to fix their infrastructure and make it more easier for you to have public transit service, and they're even fixing infrastructure in other countries and shit now. Like that's how amazing they are, and that's a socialist country compared to a capitalist country that continues to say that China is trying to colonize Africa, when they literally just forgave all, like not all, but a good amount of the loans that were, they literally forgave a lot of loans that they were helping with African countries. So that's not colonialization at all, people. That's actually trying to be a helping hand. Would you agree with that, Tanya?
Absolutely. I believe I saw recently that through the Belt and Road Initiative, China and African countries are planning on building a high-speed rail network throughout Africa. And, because of that investment, Africa will likely have a high-speed rail system sooner than the United States.
And we don't have no high-speed rail system at all, nowhere.
No. And, with... it costs for most of the major rail plans, like the one going through California, which services, a massive portion of the U.S. population, as well as plans that have been made for, the entire East Coast and east side of the country. Even getting a high-speed rail network would cost about $100 billion, which is about 10% of and that's over 10 years. That the project would go over, but that is 10% of what our country spends on the military every year.
Wow.
So
well, that's a good note to end on for people to get a full understanding of how fucked it is. Thank you so much, Tanya, for coming on and again giving us some knowledge about the current infrastructure that's happening in this country and how much we are backwards, and we need to like literally like get rid of the system if we want to literally like make changes like this, because clearly the system is built just to let this whole country crumble, and we're literally not going to have any transportation in any form if this keeps happening. Like, it's fucking done.
No. We definitely need to push for more infrastructure investment, both federal, state, and municipal levels, and definitely breaking on car dependency, which is going to force us into higher density environments and slowly get rid of the suburbs so we can start working towards something that is financially and environmentally sustainable.
Right. Thank you so much, Tanya, for coming on, and I hope you have a good day, and have a good day, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, on my black, brown, and indigenous. Gotta holler if you really feeling this. Gotta holler if you really real enough. Other rappers is delirious. Yeah, it's really that serious. Better holler if you really feeling me. I gotta keep it 100, ayy. If you don't like it, then fuck it, ayy. We gonna win in the end, yeah, we gonna live in abundance. I gotta keep it 100, ayy. If you don't like it, then fuck it, ayy. We gonna win in the end, yeah, we gonna. I gotta keep it 100. We gotta stop all the stunting. You know we coming from nothing. Yo, you talking about money, you bluffing. We gotta do something different. We gotta change how we live in. We gotta do better for women. We gotta do better for children. We gotta listen to victims, whether Jewish or Muslim or Christian. It doesn't matter your religion. You gotta stand against the system, or else you just another villain. How you just sitting there chilling?